Before we continue, it's necessary to note the various stages of Native American wars with Anglo Americans. As I mentioned previously, this contest between indigenous peoples and English settlers, later the Anglo Americans, lasted for nearly 300 years. And it can be usefully divided into sections. The first is the period between 1607 and 1889. And this consisted of contests between the English and Native Americans for our purposes. The French also fought Native Americans, but that's a separate story. Then in 1689, a series of wars began between the English and the French, and this changed the complexion of the Native American involvement in warfare. Because now what you have is a series of three-cornered contests in which Native Americans allied with the French or the English, and later when you get to the War for American Independence, the English or the Americans, and then these Native American alliances with either the English or Anglo-Americans continues on down to the end of the War of 1812, and it concludes in early 1815. The next period occurs between 1815 and 1842, when the U.S. government makes the decision to move Native American communities en masse beyond the Mississippi River to what was called the Indian Territory, what is present-day Oklahoma. They were also given other homelands in eastern Kansas and Iowa and so on. But the point of the U.S. government's objective was to move Native Americans away from areas that Anglo-Americans wished to settle. And so this movement, to some extent, was done by agreement with certain Native American communities, but in other cases, it had to be done by force. Sometimes with the kind of military coercion, like the Trail of Tears, that resulted in substantial casualties, deaths among the Cherokee, who were largely the population moved in that endeavor, and then a total of three all-out wars between the United States and the Seminole Native Americans living in Florida. Between 1842 and 1862, there is an interlude of relative peace. 1862, though, you have the American Civil War, and this leads to an opportunity for Native Americans to initiate a series of uprisings. These occur in Minnesota. They occur in what is now the boundaries areas of Colorado and Idaho. And these could be very bloody affairs. After the American Civil War, the fighting between Native Americans and Anglo-Americans continued, and a major component of this was the enforcement of the U.S. government's decision to compel Native Americans onto reservations, constricted areas of territory in which they were permitted for a while to continue their old cultural ways before the U.S. governmental policy became one of attempting to force Native Americans to assimilate into the dominant white culture. We may have a chance down the line to talk about that some. Well, let's talk now about the Native American threat to colonists and vice versa. The first thing to think in terms of is whether North America at the time of the first colonial settlement was a virgin land or a widowed land. By the time of the first permanent English settlements, Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere had suffered a massive die-off, the worst demographic catastrophe of which we have record. Since Indians themselves did not keep records, we have to make educated guesses about the population before the Europeans arrived and then what happened after the Europeans arrived. Estimates of Native American population prior to European contact range as high as 100 million living in North America, Central America, South America. We think that this population declined by at least 50% in the century following European contact, and possibly by as much as 95%. Nearly all of that loss was due to diseases brought by Europeans to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. This was particularly the case with smallpox, which was nearly always lethal. And although the major Native American contacts with Europeans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, occurred in the Caribbean and Mexico and South America at first, because of Native American trade routes that led into North America, the disease epidemic reached North America as well, exacerbated by Spanish explorations in Florida and the Mississippi River Valley, and by settlements in New England and Canada. These were not permanent settlements, they were temporary settlements created by European fishermen for a few weeks or months when they got done fishing off the Grand Banks and wanted to make landfall for a while before heading back to Europe. That was another way by which Europeans brought disease to North Americans. Here we have a graph that represents Native American population in North America between 1500 and 1800. And you can see between 1500, we're talking about an estimated 10 million Native Americans. And then that drops off to about 1 million in all of North America by 1600, and then dwindles at a somewhat lower rate thereafter. But that change between 1500 and 1600 is breathtaking. Now, early English settlers, especially the Puritans, saw this massive die-off from disease as evidence of God's favor. It created what they saw as a virgin land in which they could thrive, in which the Puritans, when they landed and developed their settlements, believed that they could develop their settlements, their towns, and so forth in relative safety because of the greatly weakened Native American communities that they encountered. But from a Native American perspective, it was what might be called a widowed land. And Native American communities, understandably, experienced tremendous social, cultural, spiritual, and economic shock from these severe losses in population. One manifestation of this phenomenon of dramatic decrease in population was a phenomenon called the Mourning Wars. These were practiced by a number of Algonquin communities. These are various nations in upstate New York, that area, but especially by the Iroquois, who were sort of the dominant nation among the Algonquins. And under these mourning wars, captured persons would sometimes be adopted to assuage the grief of those who had lost family members in battle. So what would happen is there would be fighting, there would be a death, among one or more warriors. There would be grief among the family of the slain warrior. And there was a very strong cultural sense that if this grief were not assuaged, the spiritual damage to that family would be profound. So the first recourse would be that the family would try to handle its grief sort of in a certain ceremonial way. But if that proved inadequate, as it often did, what would occur is that warriors from their community would go to the rival community, the community whose warriors had slain their own warriors, and capture members of that rival community. Didn't have to be the members who were responsible for the death of their loved one. Very often you're talking about women and children anyway. And so this had the cultural effect of assuaging grief. But it also had an important corollary effect, because by bringing the community's population back up to where it had been, it helped to ensure the community's continued viability, because these are low density populations to begin with. They lose a certain number of members and they're no longer capable of existing economically, culturally, socially. So the loss of members of the population was no small thing. So sometimes adopted into the tribe, the community. At other times, captured persons would be slowly tortured to death as another form of assuaging grief. And this could be, by our standards, by the standards of Anglo-Americans, is what I'm thinking in terms of, somewhat bizarre, because these captured persons who were going to be slowly tortured to death were adopted by the community first, and actually treated with a degree of honor prior to what was going to happen to them. And the expectation was that this person, if they dealt with this torture, this slow, all day long torture, with stoicism, that they would achieve great honor by doing that. This form of alleviating grief is illustrated by a scene from The Last of the Mohicans, which came out in 1992, when a British major was burned alive to assuage the grief of a Huron warrior named Magua. And Magua, in addition, received the daughter of a British colonel who had slain members of Magua's family. And the decision to kill the British major, to burn him alive, and incidentally, the original idea was to kill off the British colonel's other daughter, but the British major, who likes the other daughter, sort of interposes himself and dies instead. Well, the second daughter was turned over to Magua, to be in effect adopted, as a way of assuaging his grief over the members of his family who had been killed by this girl's father, Colonel Monroe by name. And The Last of the Mohicans, incidentally, is the film adaptation of a novel by James Fenimore Cooper, very famous novel, published in 1826, but set in 1757 during the French and Indian War. And it reflects, in effect, an Anglo-American cultural understanding of these morning wars. And these morning wars indicate the limitations of the dictum that you may have already heard, that war is a continuation of policy by other means. This is the definition of war that was offered by the famous Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. And it is often taken to be a universal definition of war that applies at all times, in all places, in all cultures, and in that sense, this is baloney. Um, in fact, Clausewitz was thinking specifically within the context of European nation states of the 18th and 19th centuries. And as long as you're dealing with nation states, that type, yes, the definition war is a continuation of policy by other means has some validity. But I'll tell you right now that in my opinion, war ultimately eludes definition in the same way that the concept of love has so many potential meanings that it too eludes definition. Can you talk about love? Of course you can. And we do. But we recognize that it is a complex concept, and we recognize that there is no simple definition of what love is. Well, there is no logical reason why we have to have a compact definition of what war is either. And I encourage you in this military history course and in all military history courses to be skeptical of tidy little definitions of war. And these morning wars that I've been describing illustrate that war can sometimes be primarily a cultural or a spiritual expression in which politics has nothing to do with it. Now, Native Americans had a distinctive warrior code that, like all warrior codes, and there have been warrior codes at all times and in all cultures all over the world. The Native American warrior code, like the warrior code of the samurai, like the warrior code of the Shaolin Temple monks, you may have never heard of, but you've heard of Kung Fu, the martial arts form that they created. These warrior codes all had a strong spiritual dimension. And indeed, this spiritual dimension was absolutely central to the Native American warrior code. Now, it would be wrong to say that all Native American communities had an identical conception of the warrior code. But ordinarily, this warrior code included a reciprocal relationship between warfare and hunting. Hunting was viewed as a kind of training for warfare, and when killing animals, Native Americans viewed those animals as having a spiritual dimension that must be honored. And this spiritual dimension extended to warfare, as in the practice of counting coup. Now, counting coup could involve getting close enough to a sleeping enemy to leave evidence that the warrior had shown the stealth and moral courage to slay the enemy, but had not done so. It could also involve striking an enemy a non-lethal blow to symbolically demonstrate one's spiritual domination over the foe. So in short, it was a spiritual practice rather than a military tactic. And scalping, which by the way has been said erroneously to have been a practice introduced and encouraged by Europeans, that before Europeans showed up, Native Americans did not practice scalping. That turns out to be factually incorrect. This too was spiritual in nature. By European standards, it looks savage, and Europeans, regarded it that way. But it had a richer kind of meaning for Native Americans. I'm not saying that this softens scalping or any of these other practices in any way, shape, or form. I am saying, though, that you were dealing with an artifact of spiritual or cultural understanding. Now, Native American warfare tended to be fought in such a way as to limit casualties. And that's a common phenomenon in all societies with low population density. Very seldom did Native American warfare involve conflict with persons other than warriors. They did not make war on women and children, nor did they attempt to destroy an enemy's crops or grain supply. And sustained campaigns were rare. Native American military operations typically consisted of swift, brief raids and ambushes. Europeans, on the other hand, came from societies with large populations that could and did absorb massive losses, as many as 8 million in the 30 Years' War, which occurred between 1618 and 1648. So about exactly the same time that you get the early English settlement of North America. 8 million dead. That is, if you include military deaths, which are estimated at as many as 450,000, military deaths from disease went as high as 1.3 million, and civilian deaths from massacres, disease, and malnutrition, which may have numbered as many as 6.3 million. Now, in its account of the Pequot War, this occurred in 1637, we'll look at it down the line a bit, Captain John Underhill, who was the leader of a Puritan expedition to go after the Pequot Indians, said that, quote, Native American warriors might fight 7 years and not kill 7 men. They came not near one another, but shot remote, and not point blank, as we often do with our bullets, but at rovers. And then they gaze up in the sky to see where the arrow falls. These Native Americans do not yet have muskets. They gaze up in the sky to see where the arrow falls, and not until it has fallen do they shoot again. This fight is more for pastime, it's more of a game than to conquer and subdue enemies. Now, Underhill misunderstood this kind of fighting. He thought it looked like a game. Well, he didn't grasp the fact that there was an imperative among Native Americans to limit casualties. Underhill had a further comment about the Native American style of warfare when, in recounting the aftermath of the destruction of the Pequot Indians, who were simply, the Puritans simply massacred. We'll talk about that down the line. He said that the Native American allies of the Puritans, while admiring the manner in which the Englishmen fought, were horrified by the scale of the violence the English unleashed. This is a quote from Underhill. They cried, "Machit, machit," that is to say, it is not, because it is too furious and kills too many men. Conflict with European adversaries, however, would create major changes in the Native American conception and practice of war.